She's a former co-chair of the Green Party of the United States. Dr. Margaret Flowers, you have the floor for 8 minutes to answer the first question. How did we get here?
Great. All right. So 8 minutes, we could have a discussion about this for days, but I really like to bring it back to, the founding of this country and the reality that, prior to the revolution, there was a democracy really burgeoning in the colonies of the United States. And the oligarchs, came in and with a counter revolution and basically wrote a constitution that was anti-democratic. And so, when people think about where we are, it's really where we are right now is an expression of really what the United States has always been. The elites back in that time were afraid of democracy. They didn't want the people to have power. They wrote a property rights constitution instead of a human rights constitution. And then, when we look at, Hitler, there's so much talk now about fascism. Hitler actually looked to the United States as a model. If you think about the genocide against Native Americans, the slavery, the tactics that were used during that time, Hitler was just replicating those. He wanted to expand Germany eastward. He was, a racist, white supremacist, who was using the same tactics that were used, putting people into concentration camps. Here in the United States, we call them reservations. They could also be called prisoner of war camps, is how some of my Native American allies, colleagues refer to them. And so, Hitler was just using American fascism as his style of fascism. And then, in the 19th century with the Industrial Revolution, we moved from property rights into corporate rights. And that's the situation that we face right now, is really a situation where corporations have, the power, the control over our government, our political processes. And really to look at that, I think of, there was a whole period of moving towards that. And of course, there was some pushback in the early 20th century and some gains were made. Those have subsequently, some of those have been lost. But, looking at the blueprint for this in more modern times is the Powell Memo that was written in the 1970s. And you're probably familiar with the Powell Memo written by Lewis Powell, who was he was a lawyer from Virginia and wrote it to the Chamber of Commerce. And it was a whole blueprint of developing lobbyists in Washington, D.C. At that time, there were very few lobbyists, but then it burgeoned over the years following the Powell Memo to thousands of lobbyists in Washington, D.C., to taking over education, trying to prevent people from having the political education, taking over the courts. There was a whole taking over the media. It was a whole attack to basically counter the revolutionary period of the 50s, 60s into the 70s. And so, Trump, in my view, is just a manifestation of this. He is an embodiment of what the United States really is. And he's very blatant about it. Whereas, the Democrats are more skilled at hiding who they are. I used to say when I was spending time down in Congress that, the Republicans will stab you in the front, but the Democrats will stab you in the back. And they're both stabbing you, just one is better at hiding it. And so to me, the kind of lesser evilism voting that people have been engaged in for a long time is what has brought us to this current point. We've really driven a race to the bottom because every election, people are giving their permission to one or the other of these parties by voting for them. And instead of using their vote to challenge the people that are in power and say that, no, we're not, we're not agreeing with your agenda. We're not complicit with your agenda. And so, when we look at where we are right now, we have two corporate capitalist parties. The root causes of many of the problems that we're facing are due to capitalism and corporatism. And, when we talk about Joe Biden, he's already openly declared a war on the people. He has said, if you bring a Medicare for all bill to my desk, I will veto it. He has said in the last, debate, I don't support a Green New Deal at a time when we're facing an extreme climate crisis and we're not taking the actions that we need to take to deal with that. He's an imperialist. He's stoking war with China. It's like where the national security strategy of the United States right now is great power conflict. And we see that in our antagonism towards both Russia and China. And this is putting us in a very dangerous situation, especially as the United States is, remaking our nuclear weapons so that we can actually use them. And getting out of these treaties, the nuclear treaties, and as well as the climate treaty and others. And so I think that we have gotten here in large part because that's what the United States was modeled to be, and we're just expressing that. And I think also because we have not had a real counter to that. The Occupy movement was one attempt to do that. And we were very clear when we organized that in 2011 that we were opposing both political parties. We were not allying with either one of them, that we were not going to be able to elect our way out of this situation, and that it was really going to have to be a mass movement. And I guess I'll get into that more, in the second part of this. Someone asking me that the colonies were more democratic. So there's, prior to the revolution, the colonists were actually using really democratic practices in how they governed themselves, and also how there was a big cooperative movement going on back there. John Curl writes about this in his book For All the People. Sheldon Wolin writes about how the oligarchs came in with a counter revolution to take control and prevent democracy. They were really opposed to the British government, and they would do things like, oh, 1 minute. Okay. They would literally do things like go into the courthouses and occupy them and prevent the British judges from coming in there. They would, there was a real resistance going on at that time. And that was really what led to and it was nonviolent. And then it was the violent revolution, counter-revolution waged by the property owners that kind of wrested control and prevented that, from flourishing. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Margaret. So our next speaker is going to be, for the next 8 minutes, Michael Lyon. He's a Grey Panther par excellence and a member of the Progressive Labor Party. He's also the former SF Grey Panther convener and a current board member, an energetic activist with our SF Grey Panther network, and a participant in the National Council of Grey Panther Networks. In addition, he's a board member of CARA, California Alliance for Retired Americans, and SDA, Senior and Disability Action of San Francisco. He has been and is an activist and moral force in numerous SF ad hoc activism efforts, most recently the No New Jail Coalition that successfully shut down City Jail number 4 to help shift the focus of policing and incarceration in San Francisco. And he's been honored by the SF 99% Coalition for a lifetime of tireless, courageous, and strong progressive leadership of and in direct participation in activism. And he's still going strong now in his 80s, believe it or not. Okay, Michael, take it away. We
Please
need to
unmute yourself, Michael.
Unmute yourself. Thank you. Thanks, Ann.
So as Art said, I'm Michael Lyon. I'm a member of the Communist Progressive Labor Party. And I'll be speaking from that perspective, not as a Grey Panther. So we associate fascism with racism and nationalism and anti-science, etc. But across history and across the world, the defining characteristic of fascism is that it's a severe attack on the working class, which capitalism launches when it's in serious trouble. Now, viewed this way, we've been living under economic fascism for 20 years, since the 1980s. This was when capitalism started having big bank failures and became dependent on paper profits, like junk bonds and corporate buyouts. Capitalism was also reeling from the Vietnam War expenses, and in the 50s and 60s, working class fightbacks strikes, urban rebellions, military mutinies, and campus shutdowns. The ruling class struck back with a vengeance in the early 1980s. Reagan fired all the striking air traffic controllers. Treasury Secretary Volcker raised the prime rate to 10%, deliberately causing recession and throwing tens of millions of people out of work, while employers attacked unions and demanded take-back labor contracts. Social services were eliminated or cut way back. It was the beginning of the capitalist program of austerity for the working class, wage stagnation, overwhelming debt, job insecurity, and incredible wealth inequality. We're still living that under both Democrats and Republicans, and it's only getting worse. Now, capitalism always singles out certain so-called races for greater exploitation and oppression, both to increase its profits and to divide the working class. But during these decades that we're talking about, Black and Latin communities lived under fascist occupation. For Blacks, it's been the drug wars, mass incarceration, stop and frisk, and police murder with legal impunity. For Latins, it's been ICE raids, deportation, and detention and family separation. Now, the legal background for fascism was also created in these decades. For instance, the USA Patriot Act of 2001 created a federal crime of domestic terrorism, defined as acts dangerous to human life that are a violation of criminal laws that, quotes, appear to be intended to influence the policy of government. Think about that. Many Patriot Act provisions had been recommended earlier by the bipartisan Hart-Rudman Commission, which declared that more control over Mideast oil would be necessary, and that domestic cynicism, apathy, or lack of support had to be overcome by whatever means were necessary. So fascism has been going along for many years, but now it looks different. Now we have a president and a major political party promoting everything that we traditionally associate with fascism. Why now? In recent decades, the major capitalists like Standard Oil and Wall Street banks, which profit off exploiting poorer foreign countries, have been challenged by a group of smaller capitalists like the Koch brothers, who profit from extracting domestic resources within the United States, like oil, natural gas, and mining. These domestic capitalists desperately want to stop paying the huge costs of military bases abroad, which don't benefit them. And instead, they want to focus on making big profits from just within the United States borders. But to extract big profits from just within the United States, these domestic capitalists have to, one, eliminate social services, which cost money, eliminate government regulations, which reduce profits, and promote fascist terror to force the U.S. workers to work at lower and lower wages while working harder and harder until they drop. And this is why they are promoting racism, sexism, xenophobia, fear, hatred, paranoia, contempt of democracy, and dismissal of rational thought. It's to weaken the working class resistance by intimidating, confusing, and dividing us. But the agenda of the Democratic Party, with its bigger capitalists who profit from overseas investments and banking, are no better. They want to reestablish U.S. dominance in the world to protect and expand their profits. This will ultimately mean war with China or Russia or both. Remember, in the impeachment hearings, the formal charges were abuse of power and obstructing justice. But during the hearings, Democrat after Democrat attacked Trump for not sending arms to the Ukraine and for weakening NATO and other military alliances. Progressive Labor Party believes that the only lasting way to get rid of fascism is to overthrow capitalism, which spawns fascism, and to replace it with communism, where workers control society and there's no impetus to divide, weaken, or exploit us with racism, sexism, or fascism. This will not happen soon and cannot happen peacefully. But as we work now in the groups fighting capitalism's immediate damage, we can win people to the idea that communist revolution is both necessary and possible.
30 seconds.
Thank you.
You done?
Yes.
Perfect timing. Okay, our next speaker is Norman Solomon. And I want to introduce Norman. Norman Solomon is a journalist, media critic, anti-war activist, and former U.S. congressional candidate. He's a longtime associate of the Media Watch group Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, also known as FAIR. He ran for Congress in 2012 and attended the 2016 Democratic National Convention as a Sanders delegate. Here now is Norman Solomon.
Hey, thanks, Art. Thanks, everybody. Well, about how we got here on this continent, a little over 500 years ago, the class war began, and racism and oppression of women has always been huge in human society, certainly on this continent. And I see it as part of a class war. I don't think that white people who are in the elites per se are opposed to dark skin, for instance. It's been a matter of exploitation because of the drive for profits, stealing land, a genocide of Native Americans. And through the current moment, we have a situation where class war is being waged from the top down. And so the current form of corporate capitalism is the most destructive yet in terms of the threat to the climate, as well as the continued profiteering from the military-industrial complex and nuclear weapons, threatening really the climate. And let's not forget that a nuclear war would be instant climate change, or certainly in a couple of months, the end of agriculture through nuclear winter. So we're faced with a class war situation, and attempts to roll back some of the worst realities of capitalism have certainly made some progress if you compare where we are to, say, 100 years ago in terms of human rights. But we know that there's tremendous oppression going on. Injustice is systemic. And while some of the directions of the last decades have been positive, a lot of them have been very negative. Mass incarceration, the assault on the environment, successful attacks on the facets of governance that have had aspects of democracy. A couple of books I'd recommend are Democracy in Chains and also Shadow Network, which talk particularly and document ways in which this is methodical. Margaret mentioned the Powell memo, and since that time, the last 40 or 50 years has been a very ongoing methodical approach to eroding what aspects of democracy did exist midway through the 20th century and into the 1960s and 70s. When we look at where we are now, I am in full accord with Cornel West, who said that the election coming up is a choice between neoliberalism and neo-fascism. And I think we have to just decide if we're acknowledging the reality of that. Cornel West is urging a support for Biden in swing states. I have no intention of voting for Biden. I don't live in a swing state. But I think Cornel West is correct that the choice between Trump and Biden is a choice between neo-fascism and neoliberalism. Now, some folks may want to conflate those two and say there's no difference between neoliberalism and neo-fascism. I don't think that passes the laugh test. It would be a sort of a grim laugh. I've been working through Roots Action for a coalition called Vote Trump Out. And we're at votetrumpout.org. I want to invite everybody to go there. I spent a lot of the last year and a half writing articles and organizing against Joe Biden. And no illusions about who he is and what he represents. But like Cornel West and other endorsers of the Vote Trump Out campaign, such as, for instance, Barbara Ehrenreich or Bill Fletcher, Medea Benjamin, others who have been stalwarts in progressive movements, we recognize that it's a sort of a form of gaslighting to pretend that there's no difference between Trump and Biden and the constituencies that they represent. Biden is a force and is a representative of constituencies he's galvanized and been able to manifest state power towards white supremacy. And if you simply look at the Supreme Court nominees that Trump has been able to put on the court, and the one coming up apparently is going to be put on in the next week or so, and you look at the lineup of those folks, and then you look at the appointees who are also on the Supreme Court, we're sort of encouraged sometimes on the left to believe that, oh, it's all the same. And you look at the court record, and it's sort of hard to parse why that claim would be made. I work with a prisoner support project, and a lot of prisoners are seeing what they're up against. Ones we're dealing with are very hopeful that Trump will be defeated. That's not the end. It's the beginning of some space that doesn't currently exist to change government policy. And Naomi Klein has been explicit about this, where she said that getting Biden in, which is the only way to get Trump out, is a way to roll back what is neo-fascist momentum. So I would go back to what Cornel West has been saying. This is not where we want to be. This is where we are. And so it's not a coincidence that so many low-income people, African Americans in particular, through their voting are making clear, according to all the polls, there is a need to stop, if not stop the bleeding, is to start to apply a tourniquet. Because we are headed more and more in a fascist direction. I don't know how useful it is to get into an academic discussion, but we can define fascism many different ways. But I do want to recommend a book called How Fascism Works by Jason Stanley, came out a couple of years ago. And in my last 30 seconds, I'll just mention that he says a lot of the denial about how we're moving more and more in a fascist direction is based on the illusion that when the goalposts keep moving, we get acculturated and normalized to something that is more and more neo-fascistic, and we're encouraged to believe, oh, it can't be fascism. They're not goose-stepping. We're not all in prison if we're activists. Meanwhile, there's so much that our society is in peril by the current situation. So I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you, Norman. Our speaker in this first round is V. Wright, who's Professor Emeritus from Department of Political Science at California State University, Chico, and also taught history at Skyline College in San Bruno. He's on the editorial board of the United Public Workers for Action, based in San Francisco. Thank you, George, for being here. Are you unmuted? George, you got to unmute yourself. Anne?
Okay, can you hear me now?
There you go.
Great, great. Yeah, I'm Norman. I'm going to segue up based on what you proposed. I'm going to give kind of an academic presentation about what fascism is and is Trump a fascist. There's a general consensus among historians and political theorists as to what are the characteristics of fascism. Those characteristics can include one-party dictatorship, an organized cadre of militant gangs, a disciplined, mobilized mass party, extreme patriarchy, the suppression of civil rights and civil liberties, et cetera, et cetera. Significantly, there is an allegiance to capitalist property rights and relations and a consolidation of competing capitalist interests, as well as ultranationalism, hypermilitarism, and imperialist expansion. The late Marxist political theorist Samir Amin adds, quote, "This is always accompanied by a return of backward-looking ideas, which are able to provide an apparent legitimacy to the procedures of submission that are implemented. However, despite the consensus over the characteristics of fascism, there are a range of opinions as to how to determine if a leader, movement, party, or regime is fascist. For example, one position alleges that fascism is historically specific to the conditions that existed in Germany and Italy during the interwar period, and that by implication, fascism was an aberration and it cannot exist anywhere else or at any other time. Moreover, that position purports that autocratic madmen, that is Mussolini and Hitler, were the singular reason why fascism occurred in those countries. If they had not been on the scene, fascism would not have taken form in those countries. An opposing position argues that fascism can situate at the nexus of the capital accumulation process and class struggle, and that a fascist regime can be installed or implemented in the state and by the state at a historically specific moment. Political theorist Henk Overbeck poses that, quote, "This occurs when the ruling class has temporarily lost its ability to govern and must accept the fascist option to restore order or stability, regardless of the social costs. This generally happens as a response to economic, financial crises and or socialist and or communist working class challenges. Furthermore, this position proposes that fascist regimes occur not as a result of preset plan, but actually from ongoing, intense, and sometimes violent intra-capitalist, intra-state, intra-party, and inter-class struggles over what the final political formation or regime will look like." If this sounds like what is occurring within the United States political system at the moment, that is not coincidental. The latter position can be corroborated by examining the scores of variant fascist-based regimes that existed prior to the Second World War and since, and contemporaneously by the rise and increasing legitimacy of fascist leaders, movements, and parties in the Western democracies. By implication, that position sees fascism as a political regime or project that can replace a democratic regime to more effectively facilitate capital accumulation, imperialist expansion, and the suppression of anti-capitalist working class opposition. Political theorist Michael Parenti summarizes, fascism is, quote, "nothing more than the final solution to the class struggle, the totalistic submergence and exploitation of democratic forces for the benefit and profit of higher financial circles. This brief overview of fascism leads to the pressing questions of the day. Is Trump a fascist? Is Trump attempting a fascist coup d'etat to steal the presidency if Biden is the winner? And can Trump successfully pull off a coup d'etat? Whether Trump is a fascist or not was explored by University of California, Berkeley sociologist Dylan Riley in a 2018 New Left Review article entitled, "What is Trump?" Riley concludes that Trump is not a fascist. He bases his position on the argument that the classical characteristics of fascism do not apply to Trump. Examples Riley provided includes Trump did not command an organized mass party. Trump had and continues to have, quote, "hostile relations with key sectors of the American elite." And the Trump candidacy was not supported by dominant globalized finance capital. In fact, just the opposite. Further, Trump has never had control of the state bureaucracy and the corporate-owned media. What Riley does say is that Trump's rule more closely approximates sociologist Max Weber's definition of patrimonial leadership. He elaborates, where Trump has had room to determine the character of the executive, he has operated less a modern bureaucratic party leader than a patrimonial household head. Weber explained the patrimonial office lack above all the bureaucratic separation of the private and the official sphere. I'm going to move on quickly. Nevertheless, despite Riley's categorization of Trump's leadership approach, the fact is that Trump has neo-fascist proclivities, designs, and calculations. Among many examples, this reality includes his declaration that he would like to be president for life, that since his presidential campaign began, he has cultivated, encouraged, and incited an already in existence, loosely organized neo-fascist political militia police formation parallel to the state apparatus for the purpose of mobilizing in his behalf. And he is attempting to orchestrate a fascist coup d'etat in collaboration with the Republican Party and wealthy right-wing conservatives.
30 seconds.
Furthermore, there is no question that the 14 neo-fascists who conspired to kidnap, try, and possibly execute Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer were motivated and encouraged by Trump's, quote, words and deeds. As Trump's extra-constitutional and chaotic plottings unfold, each day the combined crises of United States capitalism and United States imperialism, accelerated by COVID-19, only deepens while sharpening the domestic and global contradictions.
Thank you, George. I appreciate that. I think welcome to the Great Panthers of San Francisco Zoom meeting on fighting fascism, part 2. With that, we'll go to our second round. And this will be to talk about what we're going to do about the situation. And our first speaker, once again, will be Dr. Margaret Flowers for 8 minutes.
Great, thank you, Art. So there's a lot of messages kind of going on in the chat group about how important it is to vote for Biden, and I don't want to spend much time on that because I really want to get into how we get out of this. But I just want folks to know that I was incredibly active down in DC throughout the Obama and Biden administration, fighting the policies of Obama and Biden, and we weren't able to move Obama on Medicare for all. So to think that Biden's going to be moved to Medicare for all, I think is naive. To me, the elections aren't what matter. And I think the elections in this country become a distraction because people believe that, if we elect this person, we're going to be able to do this. And what we're seeing is just, we have a bipartisan Washington consensus that's been moving us in this direction for a very long time. And it doesn't really change depending, who's sitting in the White House. Under the Obama-Biden presidency, we almost lost our peace movement because of, and that allowed Obama to get away with militarizing Africa and the destroying Libya and declaring Venezuela a national security threat and on, surrounding China, antagonizing Russia. So anyway, the important thing here is that we're in a really crisis situation where the United States is a failing state that can't even provide for the basic needs of its people in time of a pandemic and a recession that's likely to become a depression. And the way that we're going to get ourselves out of this is to mobilize. And I just wrote a newsletter. I do a weekly newsletter for Popular Resistance. And the one that I wrote this past weekend was called What is Needed in This Moment? And I'll put a link to that. And I kind of outlined 8 different kind of things that we need to be doing right now. And the first thing is, realizing that we're in a class war. And I think Michael did a nice job of laying that out, as others spoke to that as well. And this is a bipartisan capitalist corporate class war. And it requires us to recognize that we need systemic change in this country in a whole range of levels. The second is that we need to build left solidarity. It's sad to me to see the left is defined as Democrats, because they're not leftist in any way, as we're looking at neoliberalism, right? We need an actual left in this country, and I think that it requires us, if you look at all of these platforms that have been put out by various social movements in the United States on the left, there's a lot of commonality, and so we ought to be finding ways to build bridges with each other and working together, and not letting kind of small things or false accusations divide us. I just want to mention, I have worked with Shahed Buttar for a long time in Washington, D.C., and I strongly support him in his challenge against Pelosi. And he has undergone a terrible smear. Like, why would we be surprised that he's gone under this false smear campaign when he's challenging the most important person in the House, right? So, I would urge people to, I've never really supported a Democrat, but actually I have been supporting Shahed because of the false attacks on him. So we have to get past, we have to recognize all these attempts to divide us and see them for what they are, and not allow this to prevent us from building this left solidarity. We also need international solidarity. That's why I work with a lot of social movements in Latin America. They've been experiencing US imperialism for a long time. They have a lot to teach us about how we can overcome this. It's important that we have this common vision, that we put forth a bold agenda. This is not a time to be saying that we want, reforms of this or that. We really need systemic change to address these crises. And so being really clear about what that bold vision is. A bold vision also really rallies people. You're not going to get people, excited about weak reforms. The fifth thing is mobilizing strategically. And so back in 2000, I guess it was 2018, Popular Resistance developed a free online school called How Social Transformation Occurs. And it's there if anybody wants to take. It's 8 one-hour classes plus a reading as well that goes along with that, and really gets into the phases of social movements, the different roles, the different ways that the opposition tries to undermine social movements, how you fight back against that, and then how to think strategically when you're planning your campaigns. And so we need to be working, and it's exciting to me to see there are a lot of discussion now of building towards a general strike. And we've written about that on Popular Resistance as well, about ways that we can start to train ourselves towards a general strike moment. And then, supporting each other is really important. And I'm excited to see that a lot of the mutual aid that's going on around the country. I think in our communities, getting through this health crisis and this depression, we're going to need to find ways to be able to make sure that the people around us are able to, to survive, basically, to have food and their other basic needs met. Really important, the 7th thing I wrote was staying human, because what we're trying to do is, if we're trying to create a new way of being, a more humane way of being, we have to model that. We can't allow ourselves to get dragged into the way that the right is behaving. So, and I saw this when Trump got sick, and so many people were like, oh, we wish him dead. And it's like, no, we don't wish anybody dead, as horrible as they are. Once we start to fall into that slippery slope, we become the other side. And then the last thing is just don't give up, because we never know how close we are to victory. And it always seems the hardest and the worst right before we win, because the opposition digs in and out of desperation. And so we need to just keep fighting, because we could be just around the corner from having some really big transformational changes if we take this seriously and do what needs to be done. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Margaret. Our next speaker in the second round on what we do about all this is Michael Lyon. Go ahead, Michael. You're muted. So unmute yourself. I need to unmute yourself. I think you're unmuted now.
I am unmuted. So, how to fight fascism? Well, there's a lot we don't know, but so we can just offer hints. My first advice would be to work with groups that deal with non-electoral issues, particularly racism. I think the most promising kinds of groups are groups that are fighting for working class issues like racist police terror or deportation or lack of protective gear, or groups that promote class consciousness, like groups that are fighting evictions or rent increases from corporate landlords, or groups that have militant tactics because they understand that voting or the rules that supposedly were allowed to work under the capitalists exist to prevent change, and groups that engage a lot of working class people. I think we're groups that are multiracial is very important too. I think we need to be more to think more about what workers make the economy run. You know, during the George Floyd protests, Minneapolis bus drivers and their unions refused to transport cops or arrestees during the protests, and the New York City bus drivers followed suit. I think the boss's contempt for the lives of essential workers could very well turn them into very powerful and strategic forces in fighting fascism. We definitely need to physically suppress the fascist public actions wherever possible. And I really support the anti-fascist actions last weekend. History shows again and again that if you ignore the fascists, they only become bolder and more vicious. Fighting them can work. Progressive Labor Party has a long history of fighting the Klan and Nazis nationwide. And in California, we actually stopped a statewide Klan organizing drive in the 1980s by fighting them and encouraging many others to fight them whenever they tried to make a public appearance. The Klan said that the thing they feared most was PLP. The classic example is the 1936 Battle of Cable Street against the British Fascist Union. British fascist Sir Oswald Mosley had announced that 5,000 of his brown shirts would march through London's Jewish quarter. 500,000 British, Irish, and Jewish workers went on an anti-fascist rampage when the fascists tried to enter. The battle raged for hours, but the fascists could not pass through, even though they were protected by 7,000 police. The British Fascist Union never recovered their momentum. Recently, the British Guardian wrote in response to Charlottesville, quotes, "As the Battle of Cable Street proved in 1936, and the Civil Rights Movement proved again and again across the South in the 1960s, the only way to defeat fascists and white supremacists is to meet them in head-on confrontation with strong working class social movements in the streets." So about nonviolence, I would urge that we not talk about nonviolence. You know, when we want to go into the streets and be able to obstruct the flow of business, but when we do that, we know the cops are going to attack us. Even if we don't fight back, there will be cops violence, and we can't control that. So what does nonviolence even mean in that context? If what you mean is that we won't start fights with the police, maybe it would be a lot clearer to say explicitly that. And do we not fight back if we can when we're attacked? Where do we draw the line? The biggest problem about talking about making radical change nonviolently is that it obscures the truth that capitalism relies on violence or the threat of violence to keep in power. And that's what the police and the courts and the jails are all about. We need to know this truth all the time, but especially when we're talking about fascism. We should honor and support, not repudiate, those who are able and willing to fight back against the police and against the racist. Sure, some of us are not up to fighting the fascists for reason of age or infirmity or personal responsibilities. Or there may be overwhelming odds, or we may be with people who are unwilling or unable to fight. But nonviolence in those situations are tactical decisions, not overreaching moral or global imperatives. People talk a lot about the civil rights movement and the Martin Luther King and nonviolence, but what you don't hear about is that in most cases, the civil rights workers were protected from the Klan and police by the Deacons for Defense, who were armed Black self-defense groups that stretched across the South in the civil rights period. They were working class men who were respected in their communities, and they had military experience in World War II or Korea. Committed nonviolent civil rights workers had an odd mixture of horror and grudging admiration for the Deacons and their armed patrols to protect their communities and the civil rights workers themselves. That admiration increased when the Deacons forcibly shattered segregation in many towns, which many civil rights workers were loath to do. On elections, I don't hold very much hope for fighting fascism by influencing the outcome of the elections. You know, every year we're told that this is going to be the most momentous election in modern history. Is this election hype? Well, it's not hype in the sense that capitalism and governance has been in increasing trouble since the 1970s.
1 minute.
It is hype in the sense that if we hope that outcomes of the elections are going to lead to more and better and secure lives for the working class. So we, in the fights that we're having now, we see so many instances of self-help and taking matters into our own hands of helping each other, that communism is not as far away as some people would like to convince us. And I think it's the only way that we're going to be able to get anywhere. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Our next speaker in the second round is Norman Solomon.
Based on my own experiences in the last 50 years involved in social movements and what I've been able to read and understand, I think in 2020 and looking forward, any reliance on violence by progressive social movements would be foolish and counterproductive. The reality is that we could never, even if we wanted to, begin to match the violence of the corporate state and the military-industrial complex. They love violence and they always excel at it. And of course, they're the best equipped, to put it very mildly, to utilize it. I think historically, the usefulness, the value, the long-term viability and desirability of a vanguard party have been totally refuted. And the relevance today to the realities of our social movements and the potential of our social movements, those realities have made the vanguard party approach essentially irrelevant, sort of a arcane, dusty approach that was tried a while ago, many decades ago, and we've seen it doesn't have the staying power or the ability to build the kind of societies that we want, which are based on solidarity and social justice, not on the capacity to inflict violence. I think looking at our own power structure in the United States, there's sort of a false equation that corporate media and the general political atmosphere has tended to, there's a false separation, I should say, between economic power and political power. To a great extent, economic power is political power. And meanwhile, we're encouraged to think in either or terms, which are not dialectical terms. We have a lot of different facets of healthy social movements that we need to have going on simultaneously, and they can reinforce each other. Electoral work, non-electoral work, all sorts of different realms and spheres of activities and types of activities. I think an analogy could be with a healthy garden. Healthy garden, doesn't have just one or two aspects. Let's have a lot of good trees. And that's why I sort of dread when I've been asked, what's the one thing we should all be doing? There is no one thing we should all be doing. A healthy movement has so many aspects, including cultural work and cultural flowering that we need. So, the potential for building bridges is there. It's obviously often a tremendous challenge, but it's a necessary challenge for us to engage. I remember, I was lucky enough to go to the first World Social Forum where the saying emerged, another world is possible. And we do have to keep that in mind. I believe democratic socialism is the only humane conceptual system that we should be working towards with all that we can. And I think it was at that social forum that when Eduardo Galeano spoke, he said that he often recalled some graffiti that he read on a wall in a city in Latin America. It said, "Let's save pessimism for better times." Certainly we have a lot of reasons for pessimism, but it shouldn't be immobilizing. So the organizing component, I think, is very crucial, of course, to what can be accomplished and all the different ways that we can organize, because a lot that has seemed unimaginable in a positive way has happened. I saw in the chat a comment that I'd like to address briefly, having to do with this upcoming election and the importance of voting for Biden. I don't see any importance of voting for Biden in a state like California, none whatsoever. And we're encouraged to believe that the popular vote matters. It should, but that's not reality. It is not a checkers game, it's a chess game defined by the Electoral College. If we put this to a test and we say, oh, well, the popular vote, it really matters to get a lot of votes for a certain candidate, think about 2000 and then the 8 years of Bush after 2000. It mattered not at all politically or any other way that Bush didn't get the most popular votes. Think of the last 4 years. It didn't matter politically or any other way whether Trump had gotten less than most of the votes. Obviously, he came in second in the popular vote. So I would just urge people in California, or any other so-called safe state, don't worry about it. It's all about swing states. And I would encourage you again to go to the website for votetrumpout.org. There is a video up there that we did with Noam Chomsky. And Chomsky really lays out in 2 minutes what's at stake in this presidential election. Whatever happens, though, we have a tremendous amount of work to do, obviously, in terms of organizing, and we're going to need to get it done.
Okay, Norman, are you finished for the second round?
I am.
Okay, so our final speaker in this round is George Wright. Go ahead, George.
Certainly. Thank you, Arthur. Yeah, I'm going to kind of tag off what I was talking about in the previous round and then make some comments about what needs to be done. The premise we were arguing for before was the logic of the fascist project is to restore order and stability for dominant capital in response to the deep political, economic, and environmental crises. It seems clear to me that dominant capital